¿Qué harías si todo lo que sabías cambiara de la noche a la mañana? Las tácticas que dominabas, las estrategias que destrozaron imperios, la fuerza que redujo cientos de ciudades a cenizas y cegó la vida de millones. ¿Qué harías si todo eso se volviera inútil de repente? En 1285, el imperio mongol se erigía como el imperio más grande y poderoso que el mundo jamás había visto. Desde las gélidas estepas de Siberia hasta las arenas de Persia, ningún reino podía resistir su poderío. Conquistaron no solo por su superioridad numérica, sino también con tácticas brillantes y una ferocidad sin igual. Naciones enteras cayeron en semanas. Para el resto del mundo, los mongoles eran imparables. ¿Pero qué harías si tu estrategia invencible fallara repentinamente? Los mongoles pusieron la mira en un pequeño reino, una franja de tierra llamada Bat, en el actual Vietnam, un lugar que creían que caería tan fácilmente como todos los demás. Llegaron con una fuerza abrumadora, esperando una dominación rápida y total. Sin embargo, lo que encontraron en Bat no fue sumisión, sino resistencia. Los mongoles lanzaron su invasión, confiados en sus estrategias. Trajeron consigo a sus famosos arqueros a caballo, sus temibles armas de asedio y su disciplina sin parangón. Habían aplastado ejércitos. A pesar de su poderío, los mongoles, aunque eran mucho más numerosos, se vieron atrapados en selvas inconquistables, emboscados en ríos incontrolables y luchando contra un enemigo que se negaba a combatir en su turno. ¿Qué harías si tus tácticas se volvieran en tu contra? La dinastía Tran, liderada por el brillante general Trần Hưng Đạo, transformó el paisaje en un arma. Atrajeron a los mongoles a pasos estrechos y llanuras inundadas, cortaron sus líneas de suministro y emplearon tácticas de guerrilla para atacar con rapidez y desaparecer sin dejar rastro. Lo que los mongoles habían usado para dominar el mundo, disciplina, velocidad y fuerza bruta, se convirtió en su mayor debilidad. Los pasos de montaña se transformaron en trampas mortales, las llanuras inundadas engulleron a los invasores enteros, y en los ríos, las estacas ocultas destrozaron la aparentemente imparable flota mongola. Cada movimiento de los mongoles fue contrarrestado por una estrategia desconocida hasta entonces. No se trataba solo de una batalla de ejércitos, sino de una batalla de ingenio, de resistencia, de la voluntad de un pequeño reino por sobrevivir contra un imperio que se creía invencible. Los mongoles invadieron 3 veces. Fracasaron. El imperio más grande de la tierra fue humillado no por un ejército masivo ni por tecnología superior, sino por el ingenio de un pequeño reino que se negó a arrodillarse. ¿Cómo lo logró Dejó? ¿Qué sucedió en esas selvas y ríos que cambiaron el curso de la historia? Esta es la historia de la segunda y tercera invasión mongola de Vietnam, una historia de coraje, estrategia y los límites del poder. Cuando los poderosos caen, el mundo recuerda. ¿Qué harías si todo lo que sabías dejara de funcionar? Comencemos en 1258. El imperio mongol, en la cima de su poder, dirigió su mirada hacia Hai Viet, el actual Vietnam. Bajo el mando de Urankay, las fuerzas mongolas esperaban una conquista rápida. En cambio, se encontraron con la feroz resistencia de la dinastía Tran, lo que condujo a una humillante derrota. Este inesperado revés obligó a Urankay a retirarse a Mongolia. Allí, se reagrupó con los líderes supremos del imperio, el gran Khan Monka y su hermano Kublai. Juntos idearon una estrategia alternativa para su campaña contra la dinastía Song del Sur. La corte de Hai Viet, bajo el sabio liderazgo del rey Tran Tong, previó la tormenta. En el horizonte, la conquista mongola de la dinastía Song del Sur no era una cuestión de si ocurriría, sino de cuándo. Tras haber sometido ya vastos territorios en Asia, los mongoles estaban a punto de dominar toda la región cuando aplastaran a la dinastía Song del Sur. Ante esta amenaza inminente, Javed, a pesar de su victoria, buscó una vía diplomática para salvaguardar su soberanía. Kublai Khan confirió al rey Tran Tai Tong el título de rey de Annam como estado vasallo. Junto con este gesto simbólico, le otorgó valiosos regalos, 3 piezas de brocado occidental y 6 de seda dorada. Este gesto representaba tanto una acción política como una demostración material de la riqueza mongola. Cuando los enviados de Javed visitaban la corte mongola, se enfrentaban constantemente a las arrogantes exigencias de los mongoles. Aprovechando su abrumador poder militar para mantener la paz, Javed continuó enviando numerosas delegaciones a Mongolia, presentando una fachada de sumisión y evitando astutamente el reconocimiento directo del dominio mongol. Cuando el rey Tran Tai Tong ascendió al trono, Oranai envió al enviado Nur-Udin con la exigencia de que el rey viajara personalmente a la corte mongola. Sin embargo, la corte de Javed respondió astutamente citando. Debido a la enfermedad del rey, Nur-Udin rechazó con tacto la solicitud y fue asignado a la administración mongol en las regiones subyugadas. Su papel era puramente simbólico, sin subordinados ni autoridad real. Su misión se limitaba a la vigilancia, la gobernanza y la recopilación de inteligencia sobre el reino. La corte de Javed logró convencerlo, reduciendo su influencia a la de un mero mensajero, sin impacto real en la soberanía de Javed. Para 1279, la dinastía Song se había derrumbado por completo y Kwon declaró la formación de la dinastía Yu, con su capital en Dadu, actual Pekín. El vasto imperio mongol ahora limitaba con Javed, que estaba cada vez más expuesto al creciente poder de la ONU. Con esta proximidad directa a un imperio mongol en expansión, las tensiones entre Javed y la ONU comenzaron a escalar. El punto de quiebre llegó cuando los Yuan enviaron un emisario para reprender a Javed por no informarles de la coronación del nuevo rey. En ese momento, el rey Tran Tong había fallecido y su hijo, Tran Antong, entregó el trono a su sucesor, el joven Tran Antong, a Kublai Khan. Javed era un estado vasallo y, como gobernante de un poderoso imperio, creía que el derecho a nombrar reyes en estados más pequeños recaía en él, el Hijo del Cielo. La ONU envió una severa advertencia a Javed, amenazando con acciones militares si el reino no se sometía de inmediato. La caída de la dinastía Song había tenido un profundo impacto en la corte de Javed, lo que conllevó importantes concesiones diplomáticas. Sin embargo, por encima de todo, la corte de Javed se mantuvo firme en su compromiso con la soberanía nacional, negándose a ceder ante las exigencias de Yuan. Comenzaron a prepararse para cualquier eventualidad, decididos a defender su autonomía a toda costa. En 1281, Javed envió una delegación para acompañar a un enviado mongol y explicar por qué no podían enviar una misión tributaria. En respuesta, Kublai Khan nombró inmediatamente a un enviado vietnamita como rey de Annam, mientras que ascendió a otro al puesto de ministro. También estableció una corte títere y una administración colonial en la región sur, con un ejército de 1000 soldados enviados para escoltar al nuevo rey y reemplazar al gobierno de Javed. El rey Tran Antong actuó con rapidez, envió a sus fuerzas a interceptar a las tropas mongolas en la frontera, derrotándolas decisivamente y matando al enviado mongol. Los traidores que habían aceptado las posiciones mongolas fueron ejecutados. Y reclutados como soldados, esta audaz rebeldía enfureció a Kublai Khan, quien, decidido a someter a Javed al dominio mongol, comenzó a formular planes para una invasión militar. Sin embargo, a medida que avanzaban los preparativos, Kublai se dio cuenta de que atacar Javed directamente sería una empresa difícil y costosa. El ejército vietnamita era bastante fuerte y la moral de la dinastía Tran era alta. En cambio, el estado más débil de Champa, al sur, con su limitado poder militar, se convirtió en un objetivo más factible, ofreciendo un posible trampolín para la expansión mongola hacia Javed. De la misma manera que Javed resistió las demandas mongolas de tributo y sumisión directa, el reino de Champa también se enfrentó a repetidos emisarios mongoles que solicitaban tributo. Sin embargo, al igual que Javed, el rey de Champa se negó a visitar la corte mongola y, en cambio, ofreció tributo a cambio de paz. Esta rebeldía preparó el terreno para un conflicto inevitable, y esta ocasión era un momento propicio para ejercer la fuerza sobre aquellos que se resistían. A finales de 1282, las fuerzas de la ONU, lideradas por Suatu, con alrededor de 100.000 soldados y 1.000 hombres, atacaron a Javed. Naves, incluyendo una fuerza especializada en la represión rebelde, zarparon de Guangzhou y avanzaron directamente hacia el sur, con el objetivo de alcanzar el reino de Champa. A principios de enero de 1283, las fuerzas de la ONU llegaron a la región de Bini, ahora conocida como Cómo Vietnam. Los defensores de Champa se enfrentaron a un desafío formidable. Sus fuerzas militares tradicionales, superadas por los ataques bien coordinados de la ONU, abandonaron la esperanza de contraofensivas y adoptaron estrategias defensivas. Bajo la creciente presión, el ejército de Champa se replegó a los densos bosques montañosos, adoptando tácticas de guerrilla para resistir a su adversario. Reconociendo la amenaza común, la dinastía Tran envió tropas y buques de guerra para ayudar a Champa en su lucha contra las fuerzas Yuan. En 1284, el comandante de las fuerzas de la ONU dirigió una carta a Bonn proponiendo una audaz iniciativa estratégica: establecer un centro de mando provincial en los territorios recién conquistados. Este plan preveía una red de guarniciones dispersas por la región, apoyadas directamente por los recursos de las áreas ocupadas. Dicha estructura permitiría a las fuerzas de la ONU autosostenerse localmente, reduciendo su dependencia de otros recursos. Las difíciles y extensas rutas de suministro naval habían sobrecargado su logística. La propuesta de Soto no solo abordó los obstáculos logísticos inmediatos, sino que también reveló una visión más ambiciosa: consolidar el control de la ONU sobre el sudeste asiático como plataforma para ambiciones marítimas y territoriales más amplias. Esta estrategia de doble propósito subrayó el reconocimiento por parte de la ONU de la importancia geopolítica del sudeste asiático, era tanto una barrera como un puente entre sus territorios existentes y sus ambiciones de conquista de la India. Esta recomendación caló hondo en Kublai Khan, quien aprobó el plan. Las implicaciones para Jabet eran graves. Ahora se enfrentaba a la doble amenaza de las fuerzas yuan que avanzaban desde el norte y un enemigo atrincherado al sur. El 21 de julio de 1284, el emperador Kublai Khan nombró a su noveno hijo, el príncipe Togon, comandante en jefe de la invasión de Jabet. Conocido por su carácter despiadado y decisivo, a Togon se le encomendó una de las campañas militares más ambiciosas de la historia de la ONU. La magnitud de las fuerzas involucradas era asombrosa, 50.000 soldados, superando con creces el tamaño de la primera invasión. En esta ocasión, el ejército fue meticulosamente organizado. Provisto de provisiones y apoyo logístico, reflejando el interés personal del emperador en la campaña, no solo envió a su hijo, sino que también reunió a más de 10 de los generales de élite del Imperio Yuan. Desde mediados del siglo XIII, el Imperio Yuan había fortificado su frontera con Jabet, reforzando posiciones desde Yunnan hasta Unjo. Estas fortalezas, construidas mediante implacables campañas militares y el desarrollo de infraestructura, sirvieron de plataforma para la ofensiva de 1284. Las fuerzas yuan idearon un intrincado plan de conquista. Togun ordenó órdenes urgentes al general Tono, quien reunió a sus tropas para un ataque rápido. La estrategia giraba en torno a un asalto en 3 frentes, con ejércitos avanzando simultáneamente desde Yunnan, Unjo y Champa. Esta ofensiva coordinada tenía como objetivo aplastar a Jabet de un solo golpe decisivo, allanando el camino para una mayor expansión en el sudeste asiático. Sin embargo, la dinastía Tran no era un observador pasivo. La alarma la dio primero un gobernador militar que observó a las fuerzas de la ONU concentrándose cerca de la frontera. En respuesta, el rey Tran Nan Tong convocó un consejo crucial en noviembre de 1282, donde él y sus comandantes idearon una serie de planes estratégicos para proteger el país. Su prioridad era impedir el avance de los mongoles por cualquier ruta hacia Jabet y planificaron la movilización de recursos, tropas y fortificaciones en puntos clave. En 1283, el rey Tran Nan Tong ordenó un gran ejercicio militar que marcó el inicio de los preparativos para la inminente invasión mongola. Nombró a Tran Wak Tuan, también conocido como el Gran Señor Ungda, para el prestigioso cargo de Gran General, confiándole el mando absoluto del ejército. Para infundir ánimo a los soldados, el Gran Señor Ungda redactó una famosa proclamación instando a sus comandantes y soldados a unirse en defensa de su patria. Las palabras de este documento resonaron profundamente entre las tropas, inspirando a muchos a grabar en sus brazos la frase, «Acaben con los mongoles», como símbolo de su firme resolución. A finales de 1284, los preparativos defensivos estaban muy avanzados. Los puntos estratégicos a lo largo de las fronteras, especialmente en el noroeste, fueron fortificados con soldados para crear capas de resistencia contra las fuerzas occidentales que avanzaban desde Yan. Otras tropas prepararon emboscadas en Chiang Kai-shek. En la actualidad, Langson aprovecha el terreno natural para enfrentarse al enemigo. Sus fuerzas se posicionan a lo largo de paisajes traicioneros con el objetivo de desgastar a los invasores mongoles con cada paso que dan hacia las fronteras del reino Tran. El objetivo era simple, desgaste. El gran señor Unga estableció su centro de mando en Noi Ban, la actual provincia de Bach Dang. Alrededor de esta fortaleza se dispusieron varias posiciones defensivas satélite diseñadas para ofrecer apoyo mutuo y facilitar retiradas o avances rápidos. Estos puestos interconectados aseguraban que el enemigo no pudiera avanzar significativamente sin enfrentarse a contraataques implacables. Mientras tanto, las fuerzas navales se preparaban para apoyar las fortalezas defensivas, garantizando flexibilidad tanto en el ataque como en la retirada. El propio rey Tran lideró una poderosa flota en Tonlón, simbolizando su implicación directa en la supervivencia del reino y lista para responder a las fluctuantes demandas del campo de batalla. Estos movimientos tácticos aseguraban que, sin importar dónde presionaran los mongoles, las fuerzas Tran siempre contarían con una fuerza reactiva lista para afrontar el desafío. Junto con los preparativos militares, la dinastía Tran realizó extensos arreglos logísticos. Los depósitos de suministros se posicionaron estratégicamente por todo el territorio, asegurando así el abastecimiento de las fuerzas. Nunca les faltarían recursos durante los enfrentamientos prolongados. Bajo la guía de los líderes locales, los aldeanos organizaron sus propias milicias y aportaron alimentos y otros suministros, creando una sólida red de apoyo cívico-militar crucial para la defensa. Para infundir ánimo a la nación, el rey retirado Trần Hưng Đạo organizó la legendaria conferencia de Dang. Estadistas de todo el país gritaron unánimemente una sola palabra: lucha. Su resonante declaración resonó por toda la tierra, uniendo a la población bajo un mismo objetivo. Sin embargo, ¿cómo podría una fuerza menor resistir el poderío del imperio mongol, especialmente cuando los mongoles habían sufrido una humillación en su derrota anterior y regresaron con una ferocidad sin precedentes, impulsados por el aguijón de la desgracia y el deseo de venganza absoluta? Esta pregunta pesaba sobre Jaet cuando estallaron las primeras escaramuzas a lo largo de sus fronteras a finales de enero de 1285. Las batallas fronterizas fueron feroces, pero los defensores de Jaet, en inferioridad numérica, se vieron obligados a retirarse, replegándose a los bosques y montañas o reagrupándose en posiciones de retaguardia para evitar ser rodeados. Desde el principio quedó claro que esta no era una invasión ordinaria. El 2 de febrero de 1285, Togon dividió sus fuerzas en 6 columnas, cada una avanzando a lo largo de un eje diferente. Esta estrategia explotó la superioridad numérica de los mongoles y debilitó considerablemente las defensas de Javiet. El gran señor Trần Hưng Đạo se enfrentó a la ardua tarea de contrarrestar múltiples ataques con sus fuerzas, comparativamente menores. Aún así, la abrumadora fuerza del ejército mongol llevó a Javiet al límite. Quan había aprendido una dolorosa lección de fracasos anteriores, como en 1258, cuando subestimó a Javiet como un pequeño reino fácil de someter. Esta vez, las fuerzas mongolas eran más numerosas, estaban mejor preparadas y tenían la firme intención de no cometer errores. Ante la presión abrumadora, el gran señor Hung ordenó a sus tropas dividirse en unidades más pequeñas y realizar una retirada táctica. Su destino era el río Luc Nom, donde esperaban barcos para transportarlos a la fortaleza estratégica de Banque, en la actual Aduang. Sin embargo, el plan no se desarrolló tan fluidamente como se había previsto. La batalla de Noi Van fue feroz, lo que retrasó a muchas tropas de Javiet, impidiéndoles llegar a la orilla del río a tiempo, mientras que la mayoría de los barcos lograron partir. Un contingente significativo fue evacuado. Gran parte de las fuerzas Vet, incluyendo al propio Trần Hưng Đạo, quedaron varadas en el campo de batalla. La comunicación entre las fuerzas en retirada se fragmentó, y cada grupo se retiró aislado, lo que agravó la crisis. Los mongoles capturaron muchas embarcaciones Vet, muy superiores a sus propios barcos modificados para navegar por la intrincada red de ríos de la región. Esta adquisición amenazaba con inclinar la balanza de poder en las vías fluviales a favor de los mongoles. Varado y rodeado, Trần Hưng Đạo contempló la posibilidad de retirarse a través del terreno montañoso para evadir la captura. Sin embargo, en medio de la incertidumbre, un destello de lealtad brilló con fuerza. Un grupo de soldados Vet se mantuvo firme, arriesgando sus vidas, esperando con sus barcos, decididos a asegurar la huida de su líder. Este acto de devoción permitió a Trần Hưng Đạo escapar con éxito de las garras de los mongoles en el último momento, preservando su liderazgo para las batallas venideras. A pesar de su ferocidad, los mongoles no lograron perseguirlos con eficacia, lo que permitió a las fuerzas Vet reagruparse en Banque. Aunque dispersos y desorganizados, la mayoría de los soldados lograron encontrar el camino hacia la fortaleza de Banque, donde se reagruparon bajo el mando de sus superiores. La noticia del revés llegó al rey Trần Hưng Đạo en Thăng impulsándolo a partir en una pequeña barca para reunirse con Trần Hưng Đạo en Ban Kip. Al llegar, preguntó: «Los invasores han venido a apoderarse de nuestras tierras y a derramar sangre en nuestros campos. Su fuerza es innegable. ¿Deberíamos rendirnos para salvar la vida del pueblo?» La respuesta del gran señor Trần Hưng Đạo fue: «Majestad, sus palabras son las de un gobernante compasivo, pero ¿qué hay de los santuarios ancestrales y del futuro de la nación? Le imploro que me ejecute antes de rendirme al enemigo. Mientras mi cabeza permanezca, nuestro reino perdurará con firme convicción». Aseguró al rey que había ideado una estrategia para repeler a los invasores. Tranquilizado por la inquebrantable determinación de su comandante, el rey Trần Hưng regresó a Thăng Long para preparar la armada como refuerzo para la campaña. Trần Hưng Đạo reconstruyó inmediatamente sus fuerzas. Los esfuerzos de reclutamiento en las provincias cercanas trajeron consigo un aumento de soldados, mientras que los refuerzos del noreste aumentaron la fuerza del ejército a pesar de la afluencia de nuevos soldados. La visión de una reunión tan formidable revitalizó la moral de las tropas inexpertas de Javiet. El gran señor Trần Hưng Đạo orquestó una nueva formación defensiva que se extendía desde Bach Dang hasta Banque. En este diseño, Bach Dang servía como barrera protectora para Thăng Long, protegiendo la capital imperial del grueso de los avances mongoles, mientras que Banque se convirtió en un centro neurálgico para los contraataques, albergando las principales fuerzas ofensivas. El ejército de Kviet reforzó sus defensas construyendo barreras fortificadas y fortaleciendo la armada para controlar las confluencias de los ríos, asegurando así la flexibilidad tanto para las operaciones ofensivas como defensivas. Gracias a la renombrada red de inteligencia, los mongoles discernieron la estrategia de Kviet, conscientes del riesgo de quedar atrapados en una maniobra de pinza entre las fuerzas principales en Banque y la armada imperial en Thăng adaptaron su enfoque. Los invasores decidieron atacar Banque directamente, con el objetivo de neutralizar su amenaza antes de lanzar una maniobra de flanqueo contra Thăng. Con una preparación meticulosa, Toan dividió su ejército de aproximadamente 500.000 hombres en 2 oleadas. Omar encabezó la ofensiva, liderando 300.000 soldados en un ataque multifacético contra Banque. Mientras tanto, Toen mantenía a las fuerzas restantes en reserva, preparándose para reforzar o aprovechar cualquier avance. La fase inicial comenzó con un feroz asalto de la armada de Omar contra las líneas defensivas de Vietnam, protegidas por 1.000 soldados apostados a lo largo del río. Simultáneamente, la infantería y la caballería mongolas avanzaron por las riberas, lanzando una ofensiva sincronizada. A pesar de la intensidad del ataque mongol, las fuerzas de Vietnam, con una formidable flota y tropas navales experimentadas, montaron una sólida defensa. Los mongoles sufrieron grandes bajas en repetidos intentos de romper las defensas terrestres. Tenían la ventaja debido a su temible reputación de sumisión. Las fortificaciones cuidadosamente construidas y la planificación estratégica de la caballería de Jet les permitieron resistir el ataque, pero la marea del río siguió favoreciendo a Jet. Si bien las fuerzas mongolas dominaban en tierra, su poderío naval palidecía en comparación, creando un campo de batalla dinámico y parejo. El rey Tran Nan Tong, al recibir informes urgentes de los feroces enfrentamientos, movilizó refuerzos desde Thăng. Al mando de 1000 buques de guerra y 100.000 tropas de reserva estratégica, llegó a Banque, aumentando las fuerzas de Javita casi 300.000 hombres. Durante 3 días, cerca de 800.000 soldados se enfrentaron en una batalla épica en Banque, sin que ninguno de los bandos pudiera reclamar una victoria decisiva. A pesar de sus esfuerzos, ambos ejércitos sufrieron pérdidas significativas para el 14 de febrero de 1285. Reconociendo la desventaja de sus fuerzas, el gran señor Un Xiao y el rey Tran Nan Tong dieron la crucial orden de retirada. Aprovechando su control sobre los principales ríos, las fuerzas de Javit ejecutaron una rápida retirada a lo largo del río Dang, dirigiéndose hacia Thăng. Sin embargo, la retirada tuvo un alto costo. Para garantizar la seguridad del grueso de las fuerzas, ciertas unidades se quedaron atrás como retaguardia, con la misión de retrasar al enemigo. Con gran sacrificio personal, sus esfuerzos ganaron un tiempo crucial, permitiendo que el grueso del ejército se reagrupara y reforzara sus defensas. A pesar de sus mejores esfuerzos, las fuerzas navales de Omar no lograron cortar la retirada de Jungla Viet. Frustrados pero no desanimados, los mongoles lanzaron una persecución implacable hacia Thăng. En su camino, desataron una devastación generalizada, dejando destrucción y sufrimiento. Aldeas fueron arrasadas, civiles masacrados y el caos se apoderó de ellas. Los soldados capturados de Jungla Viet, identificados por las palabras tatuadas Satat, muertos para los mongoles, fueron ejecutados en masa en arrebatos de furia. Esta brutalidad subrayó lo mucho que estaba en juego en el conflicto, ya que Jungla Viet se enfrentaban no solo a la conquista, sino a la aniquilación en regiones clave. Pequeños grupos de guerreros resueltos, unidades suicidas en esencia, tenían la misión de frenar el avance enemigo, sacrificándose para ganar tiempo para la estrategia más amplia del reino. Desde Bach Dang, los mongoles cruzaron rápidamente el río Yon, capturando áreas cercanas y posicionándose para amenazar Thăng desde el este. Creyendo que las repetidas retiradas significaban una resolución debilitada, Togon redactó una carta de rendición y la envió al rey Tran. Sin embargo, la corte de Tran, firme e inflexible, no mostró signos de capitulación. El liderazgo de Jungla Viet inició una meticulosa defensa de su capital. Se evacuaron civiles y suministros para minimizar las pérdidas, mientras que medidas estratégicas transformaron Thăng en una fortaleza impenetrable alrededor de la ciudad. El ejército desplegó buques de guerra para proteger las rutas fluviales a lo largo de las orillas. Se erigieron barricadas de bambú y madera, reforzadas contra buquetes colocados estratégicamente detrás de estas barreras. Fuera de las murallas de la ciudad, trincheras y rampas fortificadas proporcionaban una capa adicional de protección. La posición defensiva clave se estableció en Yongbao, donde el núcleo del ejército de Jy Viet se enfrentó a los mongoles al otro lado del Río Rojo. El 18 de febrero de 1285, Tun dirigió personalmente a sus tropas, asegurando una estricta disciplina dentro de sus filas. Oleada tras oleada de infantería mongola avanzó bajo el fuego implacable de las máquinas lanzapiedras y ballestas de Jy Viet estacionadas en la orilla sur del río y a bordo de los buques de guerra, a pesar de sufrir grandes bajas. Las tropas mongolas persistieron en la construcción de puentes de pontones bajo una lluvia de flechas para cruzar el río. Al llegar a la orilla sur, los invasores se toparon con una segunda línea de defensa, barricadas de madera reforzadas por los arqueros de Jvet. La sangrienta confrontación continuó, y las fuerzas de asedio mongolas finalmente rompieron las barreras de madera y avanzaron hacia las murallas de Tunglon. Su determinación, unida a su superioridad numérica, los acercó peligrosamente a penetrar las últimas defensas de la ciudad. Pero poco sabía Togan que el curso de la campaña estaba a punto de dar un giro que pondría a prueba la propia resolución de sus fuerzas. Mientras la segunda invasión del Imperio mongol a Jvet se intensificaba, el resultado estaba lejos de estar decidido. ¿Qué sería de la misión de Togan? ¿Cambiará la marea a favor de los mongoles o resurgirá la resistencia de las fuerzas de Jvet? La historia está lejos de terminar. Asegúrate de suscribirte y activar las notificaciones para no perderte la apasionante conclusión de este extraordinario enfrentamiento histórico. La segunda invasión mongola de Jvet había llegado a un punto crítico. Durante meses, las fuerzas mongolas habían abierto un camino brutal a través de el reino, tras arrasar capa tras capa de defensas y dejar un rastro de devastación. Finalmente sus fuerzas se alzaron ante las puertas de Tunglon, el corazón del reino. Sus tácticas representaban una amenaza para las últimas defensas de la ciudad y estaban listos para asestar el golpe decisivo. Para entonces, los mongoles habían perfeccionado la guerra hasta convertirla en un arte, eran conquistadores de continentes, sus estrategias forjadas en el crisol de innumerables batallas en diversos terrenos. Pero Jvet presentaba un nuevo tipo de desafío. Se enfrentaban a un adversario que personificaba la adaptabilidad y la resistencia, empuñando no solo armas, sino también la tierra misma como herramienta estratégica. Los densos bosques ocultaban emboscadas, los ríos se convertían en laberintos y la unidad del pueblo de Jvet infundía a su resistencia un espíritu inquebrantable. La ciudad se encontraba ahora al borde de la destrucción. ¿Podría Trần Hưng Đạo, el brillante comandante de Jvet, burlar a la imparable máquina de guerra mongola? Era una batalla por la supervivencia, por el alma de Jvet y por el legado de su pueblo. ¿Lograría el genio de Trần Hưng Đạo obrar otro milagro o se sumaría Jvet a la lista de ciudades destruidas? Tras una larga lista de conquistas mongolas, y comprendiendo la gravedad de la situación, el rey Trần Nan Tong y su sucesor, el rey retirado Trần Nan Tong, ya habían orquestado una retirada calculada. Anticipando la intención de los mongoles de cortar su ruta de escape meridional, tomaron la decisión de evacuar a la corte y al mando militar. Esta retirada se llevó a cabo en secreto, permitiendo que el liderazgo de Jy Viet y la mayor parte de sus fuerzas se replegaran hacia Tien Truon, actual Namjin, y Lesos, ya que Tun atrincheró sus fuerzas ante las puertas de Tonlon. Confiado en sus tácticas de asedio, desconocía la retirada del liderazgo y el ejército de Jy Viet. La batalla por la capital ya había concluido antes de que sus tropas penetraran en la ciudad. Expertos en la guerra de asedio, sus tácticas demostraron ser claramente efectivas contra las defensas menos fortificadas de Jy Viet en comparación con otros reinos. Tonlon cayó en menos de un día, una prueba de la pericia de los mongoles. Los barcos de guerra de Jy Viet se vieron obligados a retirarse hacia el sur bajo presión, y algunos abandonaron sus naves para buscar refugio en tierra. El 19 de febrero de 1285, las fuerzas mongolas marcharon. Llegaron a Tunglon, pero solo encontraron una ciudad desierta. Todo rastro de la corte Tran, el ejército e incluso la población habían desaparecido junto con los suministros y tesoros de la ciudad. El botín que buscaban, provisiones, riquezas y cautivos, no existía. No quedaba ni un solo grano de arroz ni ningún civil para que los invasores saquearan. La evacuación estratégica orquestada por la dinastía Tran convirtió la victoria mongola en un logro vacío, frustrando a los invasores. Desesperados por asegurar un éxito más tangible, Togon envió fuerzas para perseguir al ejército de Jy Viet en retirada. Mientras los mongoles celebraban su aparente victoria con un gran banquete dentro de la desolada ciudad, el ambiente en el campamento mongol distaba mucho de ser festivo. Abandonó la desolada Tunglon y estableció un nuevo campamento fuera de las murallas para esperar noticias de su vanguardia. Mientras tanto, El frente occidental en el noroeste era igualmente tenso. Trần Hưng Đạo, al mando de las fuerzas de Javiet, se enfrentaba al ejército Yuan de Nasar Alin, de 10.000 hombres, que avanzaba desde Yunnan. Su misión era dividir las fuerzas de Javiet, impidiéndoles. En Kua, los líderes locales, oponiéndose completamente al ejército principal de Togan, hostigaron al ejército Yuan con tácticas de guerrilla, retrasando su avance y debilitando sus líneas de suministro. A pesar de esto, Nasser al-Din avanzó, enfrentándose finalmente a las fuerzas de Tranot Du en Tuat. Superado en número, Tranot Du ordenó una retirada estratégica, trasladando sus tropas por río y tierra para evitar emboscadas de la ONU. En febrero de 1285, se reagrupó en Tomji tras enterarse de la caída de Tunglon. Nasser al-Din llegó a Togon con tan solo 1000 hombres. No obstante, la campaña de Javiet había agotado los recursos y trastocado el plan de la ONU, convirtiendo el noroeste en un frente costoso e ineficaz para esta. Aunque la capital había caído, la destrucción de uno de los 3 frentes del ataque Yuan permitió a la dinastía Tran reorientar sus esfuerzos para contrarrestar las nuevas amenazas del norte. El ejército de Togon avanzó con ímpetu, mientras que al sur las fuerzas de la ONU presionaban con implacable agresividad. La situación exigía una resolución extraordinaria y una brillantez estratégica por parte de los líderes de Yet para asegurar la victoria. Tras la toma de Tunglon, Tun puso gran énfasis en sus fuerzas navales como vanguardia de su campaña. Su flota persiguió con implacable precisión al liderazgo de TR en retirada. Estos buques de guerra, apoyados por caballería de élite, formaron una fuerza de ataque de decenas de miles de hombres, las mejores unidades que Togon comandaba. Mientras tanto, Tun mantenía una considerable fuerza de reserva en Tunglon bajo el mando del experimentado general Arik Kaya, a menudo considerado el verdadero estratega tras la invasión. Arik Kaya planeó meticulosamente cada movimiento, actuando como consejero de confianza de Tun en un esfuerzo desesperado por retrasar la persecución de la ONU. La corte de Tran envió a la princesa Ana Togon como ofrenda de paz. Su acto desinteresado dio un tiempo valioso a las fuerzas de Javiet para reorganizarse, ya que incluso breves retrasos en la persecución de Wan tenían importantes implicaciones estratégicas. Mientras las tropas de Javiet lograron contener a los invasores durante un día en Noban y 4 días en Banque, el silencioso sacrificio de la princesa On retrasó la conquista un mes, mientras las fuerzas Yuan avanzaban. Javiet estableció posiciones defensivas a lo largo de los canales que se extendían desde Tunglon hasta Tien Tron.
Area's distinctive geography dotted with numerous islets created ideal conditions for coordinated land-to-waterer operations. The narrow stretch of river with its natural choke points provided a strategic advantage for the forces to use the few to overcome the many. The islets divided the river into 2 branches, enabling the navy to position themselves on both flanks while their infantry held the central ground. The Javat and Yuan forces clashed in a fierce battle, with both sides suffering significant losses. Ultimately, the Vaich forces strategically withdrew to Tien Truong, while the UN army regrouped. With Togon among the fallen was General Tran Bin Trong, whose capture led to one of the war's most iconic moments. When offered a position as a northern king under the UN, he defiantly declared, "I would rather be a ghost of the south than a king of the north." His unyielding spirit remains a symbol of Javiet's resistance. Stationed in Thăng Long, Tun awaited So's forces advancing from the south while fortifying key strongholds across the occupied regions. Despite initial victories, the Mongol army gradually fell into a war of attrition meticulously orchestrated by Trần Hưng Đạo. As they expanded their occupation, their forces were stretched thin, tasked with defending critical points like Lang Jiang Vank and Thăng Long, while maintaining extended logistical lines from the northern border. The Mongols heavily relied on distant supply lines and pillaging local resources. However, the Vaich population countered by hiding provisions and mounting fierce resistance. This strategy became a decisive factor in undermining the Mongol campaign, initially envisioned as a swift conquest leveraging superior strength. Instead, the prolonged campaign strained their resources with every passing day, weakening their forces visibly. In early March 1285, King the Tronan Tong and Great Lord the Tran Hang Shao launched a decisive counterattack, reclaiming Vank and severing the enemy's supply lines. These setbacks threw the Mongol command into disarray. Encircled by Javat forces from 2 fronts, Tun's army was compelled to seek reinforcements from Kuan. Yet relief for Tun did not come from the distant Han capital, but from Soto's army. Despite their exhaustion and dwindling supplies, So Edu's force, numbering over 880,000 soldiers and supported by hundreds of warships, pushed northward. The Tran dynasty anticipated this southern threat, preparing numerous defensive positions to exhaust Su's forces. However, these measures proved insufficient. Soto's army advanced steadily into Nikan. Emperor Tran ordered Tran Daitat to intercept the invaders and later dispatched Tran Quang Kai to lead the southern defenses, recognizing the risk of being in a pincer movement. The TR leadership treated this southern invasion with the utmost gravity. Compounding the situation was the defection of local rebel groups to Sot. These groups, familiar with the terrain, guided the Mongol forces to exploit weaknesses in Jet's defenses and supplied them with much-needed provisions. This nullified many of the JV's strategic advantages, forcing them into a reactive posture. On March 9, 1285, So's forces attacked Javit troops in Tangoa despite outnumbering the enemy with 100,000 troops. The Javit army was caught off guard and suffered a devastating defeat. Adhering to their principle of preserving their core strength, the Vaich forces retreated swiftly. Sot capitalized on the victory, advancing northward to join Togon, recruiting additional troops, primarily former Song Chinese citizens in Javit, and bolstering his army size considerably with the pressure in the north easing. Tun seized the opportunity to strike, noticing the fractured state of Jvat forces around Tien Truong. He launched an offensive. Togon's army, previously scattered between Thang Long and Thien Truong, began consolidating their strength. The two armies clashed repeatedly during their maneuvers, but the pivotal battle unfolded at Thien Mac. Here Ton's reinvigorated forces delivered a crushing blow to the Javit army. Driven by a surge of morale and the desire to avenge earlier humiliations, the Mongol troops fought with renewed fervor, venting their frustrations and restoring their commander. Battered pride as the Tran army withdrew to the Tian Truong to avoid catastrophic losses. General Trần Hưng Đạo quickly abandoned his position at Vank to come to the king's aid. Togon, sensing his chance, resolved not to let King Tran slip away again. With unwavering determination, Togon committed all his force to a singular objective: capture or kill the Tran ruler and bring an end to this costly and prolonged chase. The urgency of the situation weighed heavily on Tran court. The Mongol forces advanced relentlessly, their might as unstoppable as a storm. The Tran fleet lay in tatters. Morale was faltering, and fear gripped the hearts of the soldiers. With the odds stacked against them, a daring plan was needed to ensure survival and evade the enemy's tightening grip. How could they escape quickly and vanish without a trace, all while the enemy closed in with furious speed? For Trần Hưng Đạo, the answer was simple yet audacious: flee to the open sea by heading toward the Gi estuary in Namjin and leaving no trace of their movements. Toan and his forces would be left guessing with no clear trail. Togon would face endless possibilities about Javiet's next steps. This uncertainty would force him to scatter his forces in pursuit, fragmenting their overwhelming strength. Trần Hưng Đạo executed this plan to perfection. Once safely beyond the estuary, the Tran fleet sailed toward what is now Quang Ninh. As anticipated, Toan divided his forces, launching exhaustive searches along Vietnam's coastline and even into southern China. Desperate to find the Tran king to buy even more time, the Tran forces deployed a decoy strategy. They even sent out the king's vessel to lure the Mongols into chasing a phantom target. This diversion swelled further confusion and granted Vaich the breathing room needed to regroup and strategize. Meanwhile, the noble families and high-ranking officials in Tien Truong, fearing for their lives, defected to the Mongols, offering loyalty in exchange for safety and favor. Buoyed by these defections, Togon grew more determined than ever to hunt down the elusive Tran court. But something was amiss. Despite his relentless pursuit, Togon was faced with a bewildering game of shadows. Reports of the Tran king's location shifted constantly. An army of thousands seemed to disappear and reappear like phantoms. Behind the confusion lay a deliberate strategy. The Vaich king and his retinue had quietly relocated to Thhoa by alternating between land routes and waterways. They erased their trail with precision, vanishing into the dense geography of Vaich. Meanwhile, the Yuan forces chased after rumors. Exhaust gripped the soldiers as they marched day and night, sustained only by fragmented leads, yet they never caught even a glimpse of their prey. Tun's forces were running on fumes, physically drained and mentally fractured by the chase. As the pursuit dragged on, Togon's army faced a logistical nightmare. Supplies dwindled alarmingly as they remained stranded in Thien Truong, far from their primary supply lines. In a desperate bid to salvage his campaign, Toan dispatched troops to scavenge food along the route to Thăng Long. He himself returned to the city, clinging to the faint hope that the Tran king would stumble into his grasp. Once again, Vaich had demonstrated its mastery of asymmetric warfare. By leveraging the terrain's swift mobility and deliberate misinformation, the Tran court not only eluded capture but also drained Tun's forces of morale and resources. News of the Tran king's location in Tanoa finally reached Sogu. Seizing the opportunity, Togon immediately dispatched 60 warships from Truong Yen, accompanied by 1,300 naval troops, to join forces with Sugu. Their mission was clear: crush the elusive Tran court and eliminate this persistent thorn in the UN side. Victory seemed within reach. What Toan failed to account for, however, was the crushing fatigue of his troops. After endless marching, relentless skirmishes, and scant provisions, both his troops and Sote forces were pushed to the brink. Itself offered little relief. Its barren lands yielded little more than a meager catch from the sea. Days of inconclusive fighting only deepened their fatigue. Frustrated and increasingly weakened, Tun's troops decided to withdraw. Their immediate priority shifted from crushing Vaich to simply finding fertile regions where they could replenish their dwindling provisions, but relief was nowhere to be found. The Tran dynasty's steadfast implementation of a scorched earth strategy left nothing value for the invaders. For an entire month, Tun's army endured hunger, disease, and relentless harassment. Local guerrilla forces emerging from the mountains struck with precision and ferocity, inflicting devastating losses. Mongol troops, already weakened, faced wave after wave of ambushes, unable to find respite or resources. The situation became dire, stripped of food and morale, and harried by resilient Vaich forces. Tun's campaign devolved into chaos. Their troops suffered humiliating losses as the unyielding people of Javat turned every corner of their homeland into a battlefield. By late May, Jet's forces had recovered their strength, ready to deliver a decisive blow to the UN. Well-fed and rested, their spirits soared as they set their sights on reclaiming the imperial capital Thăng Long and expelling the invaders once and for all. The plan was cutting off the sprawling enemy's communication lines along the Red River, isolating Sagu and Togon, and retaking key positions around the region. To succeed, Jet's troops needed to march swiftly and strike decisively, employing the very tactics of lightning warfare that the Mongols had once mastered in a masterstroke of psychological warfare. Vaich disguised their forces and sung military armors for them. The sight of their old enemies, who they thought defeated for good, was like facing ghosts that rose from the dead to haunt them, whether interpreted as the ghosts of their conquests or remnants of a resurgent song resistance. The sight struck fear deep into the hearts of the Mongol soldiers. The Vaich army moved with remarkable speed and coordination, overwhelming the UN positions one by one. Each victory
Empire was intensifying its military preparations in the southern regions. King Tran and Tong, sensing the impending danger, called for a meeting with the Great Lord of Hung Dao. He asked if the UN forces were preparing to invade again. The Great Lord responded that Vet had lived in peace for so long that the people had become unfamiliar with military affairs. The previous year, when the UN forces had invaded, there had been some defections and retreating soldiers, yet thanks to the reputation of their ancestors and the power of the reigning monarch, the enemy had been driven out. If the Yuan forces returned, the Viet army was now more experienced in warfare, and the Yuan soldiers would be haunted by their previous defeat. He was confident that victory would be certain. Despite a brief period of peace, there was no room for complacency. Under the leadership of Great Lord Hung Shao, the entire nation military was reorganized, and fortified recruitment campaigns were launched to bolster troop numbers. Weapons were stockpiled and soldiers trained relentlessly day and night. Meanwhile, the civilian population, having just begun to recover from the last war, once again turned their efforts to stockpiling food, crafting makeshift weapons, and preparing to evacuate if necessary. Families stockpiled food, crafted weapons from whatever they could find, and prepared themselves for the worst. Villages buzzed with quiet determination, the kind that turns fear and resolve. But this wasn't just about men and steel. It was a battle of strategies, drawing lessons from earlier conflicts. Viet meticulously prepared fallback bases which could serve as sanctuaries in case of setbacks. Knowing the Yuan Navy's reputation for dominating the seas, Hunga fortified the northeastern coast. Strongholds were built, and elite troops stationed at every vulnerable point to lead the coastal defense. He chose Tran Kondu, a general whose brilliance on the battlefield was matched only by his fierce loyalty. Kondu took command of a powerful navy at Van Harbor, setting up an intricate web of ships and soldiers ready to clash with the invaders the moment they dared to approach. By late autumn of 1287, the UN had gathered a formidable force of 300,000 troops. This massive army included a diverse array of soldiers, former Southern Song troops, Mongol cavalry, Jurchen warriors from Jin forces from Yunnan, and Dali conscripts from Hainan Island, and recruits from Guangshi, combined with veteran soldiers from previous invasions. This coalition represented a serious challenge to Tvet as the UN prepared for yet another campaign against Tvet. They placed their trust in a familiar face, Toan, the seasoned commander, who had seen these lands before. Alongside him were other battle-hardened generals, veterans of past skirmishes in Viet. This time the UN forces were divided into three powerful contingents. Togan led the main army, massing in Ganji. Meanwhile, a secondary force was stationed in Yunnan, poised to coordinate from the west. Finally, The Yuan Navy assembled at Kamcha ready to sail across the sea and strike Diet's coastal defenses. Learning from their previous defeat, the Yuan Navy came better prepared. They brought 2 massive fleets, including supply ships carrying an astounding 700,000 chi of grain, an enormous logistical improvement designed to reduce their reliance on difficult and manpower-intensive overland supply lines. If you're wondering how much that is in today's terms, 1 ch equals about 330 pounds. Can you picture it now? That's over 230 million pounds of grain. Staggering, isn't it? The sheer scale of this operation only leaves us in awe of the planning and resources poured into this campaign. Their combat fleet boasted over 600 warships manned by tens of thousands of elite marines, some of the finest sailors and fighters the Yuan Empire could muster. To further bolster their efforts, Omar, another trusted commander, was tasked with a critical mission to secure and protect the vital supply fleet. His role was twofold: ensuring the safe passage of provisions while also countering Viet's feared naval forces. The UN knew that controlling the waterways would be essential for their campaign success, and Omar's fleet would play a pivotal role in challenging D's dominance at sea. But the UN didn't rely solely on brute force. They sought to exploit internal divisions within Dvet. In their ranks stood a shadowy cohort of traitors, nobles, and former princes of the Tran dynasty who had defected to the UN, lured by promises of survival and power. These collaborators were propped up as a puppet regime by Kublai Khan, intended to sow discord among the Dvat people and weaken their resolve. For these turncoats, the gamble was clear: trade their royal lineage for the chance to retain wealth and influence under Un rule. On October 11, 1287, Togan and the UN Mongol army set out a juggernaut rolling south toward Dvet. By December 25, they had reached the border, where the Dvet frontier forces clashed briefly with the UN vanguard. Before withdrawing, Toan executed a classic maneuver, splitting his army into 2 divisions, one marching southward, the other advancing eastward. At first glance, the Mongols seemed unstoppable, swiftly taking control of these frontier outposts. But this time Dvet was playing a different game. Learning from past encounters, they no longer stationed heavy defenses at the border. Instead, their strategy hinged on drawing the invaders deeper into their rugged northern terrain. The southern column, UN troops, advancing quickly, found themselves in unfamiliar territory. By the time they reached Bakong, they were met with fierce resistance. The elite troops of Dvet had been lying in wait. Their ambush, meticulously prepared, coordinated land and naval forces launched a devastating assault, raining down arrows, many tipped with poison, on the invaders. The Mongols, from the generals to their rank and file, were thrown into disarray. They were no strangers to archery, but Viet's deadly precision and poison arsenal left them stunned and suffering heavy losses. Terrified, they retreated to regroup. Meanwhile, Toan's eastern column made swifter progress, marching steadily toward Vank, a critical strategic location nestled near the confluence of rivers and mountains. Within just 4 days, they reached the area, only to find themselves staring at another formidable Dvet defensive line. The Dvet forces had entrenched themselves with their backs to the river and their flanks protected by the surrounding mountains, creating a nearly impregnable position. Togan, scarred by the memories of past defeats, knew better than to recklessly push toward Thăng Long, Viet's capital. Instead, he shifted his focus to Vank, recognizing it as the key to controlling crucial routes, including the maritime zones. Holding Vank would not only limit the maneuverability of D's naval forces, but also provide a solid base for further operations. The last time he had overcommit to a southern push, Great Lord Hung Da had struck from behind, cutting off the Mongols' retreat and forcing Togan to scramble for reinforcements. Now, with the strategic significance of Vank keep clear, the stage was set for a high-stakes standoff. But if Toan had grown wiser, so did Great Lord Hung Da. The Dvat strategy had shifted dramatically. Gone were the rigid, large-scale defensive lines of old. Instead, Hung Da adopted a flexible approach, always ready to retreat and regroup. His troops were poised to move at a moment's notice, their warships ready for a quick escape if needed, and yet appearances can deceive. Hung Da arrayed his
forces in such a way that it seemed like he was prepared for a massive showdown, forcing Toan to pause and wait for reinforcements before committing to a full-scale attack. What he was waiting for was the arrival of Omar's naval forces, which would come through the Bach Dang River. On December 20th, the UN fleet set sail from Chino, cutting through the waters and heading toward the coast of Viet. 3 days later, they reached the seas near Van Nien, modern Mong Kai, where Dvet forces had set an ambush attempting to block their advance. Outnumbered and outgunned, the Dvat forces couldn't hold them back for long. Rather than engaging in a futile direct defense, the Dvat navy waited patiently, targeting the UN's rearguard. As the UN fleet moved deeper, the Dvat launched a sudden and devastating attack on the trailing ships, capturing supplies, horses, and prisoners. By the time the UN forces reached the waters of donde, they met the main Dvat fleet. Here a fierce battle unfolded. Despite their best efforts, the Dvat forces suffered heavy losses and were eventually forced to retreat. The UN fleet successfully pushed, making their way upriver to the Bakong River, to regroup with Togon near Vank. So after days of waiting, all the Mongol forces were finally back together under Tun's command. We're talking nearly 300,000 troops, both land and naval forces. To put it in perspective, this was a force far bigger than anything the Mongols had thrown in previous campaigns. And then, after all that waiting, Great Lord Hunga must have had a brilliant plan to wipe out this massive Mongol force, right? But when the moment came, he did something unexpected. He ran. After watching the Mongol forces gather, Hunga decided that staying and fighting in the open wasn't the wisest move. He knew the battlefield could shift in his favor with a little more patience. So Diet's forces retreated, regrouped, and started to prepare a new line of defense. The battle that followed at Vank, it was over almost as quickly as it began. The Mongols, though still powerful, didn't face the kind of devastating losses they had expected. Both sides had minimal casualties, but the Mongols managed to seize Van Keep without much resistance. Togon, seeing an opportunity, quickly set up a stronghold there. Vank wasn't just a strategic location, it was the key to controlling the surrounding areas. Toan fortified the region with wooden walls, supply depots, and a well-established basi, eager to build on his momentum. Meanwhile, after retreating from Vank, Home quickly moved his forces to a new stronghold along the Duong River, setting up defenses to protect Thăng Long from the north. The king and the court were already making plans to push forward. When the time came, they had no intention of letting Togon gain any more ground on the northwestern front. The story was similar to earlier encounters. A group led by Truett, one of Hung Da's most trusted commanders, set up another defense line, this time made up of around 40,000 soldiers from various ethnic groups. The Mongols had already begun pushing into Viet from Yunnan in December 1287, but their advance wasn't smooth. Viet's smaller, more mobile forces harassed them, forcing the Mongols into numerous skirmishes and heavy losses. Yet despite these troubles, the Mongols were still a massive threat, and their troops were pushing forward. The civilian militia of Viet, though skilled in guerrilla tactics, were ultimately unable to stop the Mongols' relentless march. On December 11th, 1287, the Mongol forces finally reached Bach Ha and clashed with Trut Dat's troops. Both sides had roughly the same number of soldiers, but the Mongols were far more seasoned and battle-hardened. The Dvet forces were at a disadvantage, and soon found themselves losing ground. In a desperate move, Chio Van Vang gave the order to abandon their boats and retreat toward Pulu Wang. Meanwhile, the Dvet generals held the line, sacrificing themselves to slow the Mongols down, buying precious time for their forces to fall back, regroup, and reorganize. Despite the Mongols taking control of the area and seizing the Viet ships, they were far from victorious. On December 19th, the Mongol launched a continuous assault on Pulong, attacking the fortress for several days in a series of 18 major and minor skirmishes, but the Dvat forces held firm. It was a battle of persistence, a test of who could last longer. During this time, Tron Kundu was quietly gathering the remaining forces, preparing a trap at Von John near the stunningly beautiful waters of Halong Bay. By the first days of February 1288, the Mongol supply ships, cumbersome and slow, finally arrived. These ships, despite being massive, were heavily laden with supplies and lacked the protection of a fighting navy. They were the perfect target for Tranondi's ambush. As the Mongol supply ships entered the trap, the Dvet forces sprang into action from Vannon John. The ship surged forward with relentless speed, catching the Mongols completely off guard. The surprise was overwhelming. Mongol ships capsized, and many Saldi heirs drowned in the chaos. The Mongols tried to fight back, but the situation was already slipping beyond their control. They desperately tried to push forward, but the ships, heavy and unwieldy, became stuck in the mud, trapping them in place. In a last-ditch attempt to save their forces, the Mongols began throwing their supplies overboard, hoping to lighten the load enough to escape, but it was already too late. The Viet forces, united in their determination, closed in on the Mongol fleet, cutting off any possibility of retreat. Almost the entire Mongol fleet was destroyed or captured. The Dvet forces pulled off one of the most decisive blows in their resistance against the mighty Hun army. They captured an unthinkable haul of food, weapons, and ships, a treasure trove of resources that couldn't even be counted in its entirety. This single victory wasn't just about the material gain, it shattered the Yuan's logistical backbone and threw their entire invasion into disarray. Now it's worth noting that this wasn't the first time the Mongols found themselves in such a grim predicament. This marked the third invasion attempt under Kuan, and yet history seemed to repeat itself. By cutting off the Yuan supply chain, the Tibet forces didn't just score a tactical victory, they shifted the entire balance of the war. It's what you'd call using ease to await exhaustion, staying rested and ready while waiting for the enemy to wear themselves out. The TR military knew they couldn't match the UN army at full strength, well-fed and freshly supplied, so instead they struck at what truly mattered most, their lifeline. After all, no matter how fierce or disciplined, soldiers are still human. Without food, no one has the strength to wield a sword, let alone fight a battle. Hunger strips away everything: morale, energy, and even the will to keep moving forward. The D commanders understood this universal truth. Rather than confront the unanimous heathen, they went straight for what kept the invading force alive. In this scenario, the war would have turned into a waiting game. Stranded and unfamiliar terrain, the Yuan army might have soon found themselves contending not just with the Viet's calculated tactics, but also with the unforgiving reality of dwindling provisions. As time dragged on, their strength would fade, their numbers dwindle, and the relentless tropical climate would take its toll. Losses from hunger and illness could easily have exceeded those from combat. The D forces meanwhile stood firm, conserving their energy and preparing for the right moment to strike. It wasn't just about outlasting the enemy, it was about understanding their limits. And just like that, what seemed like an unstoppable invasion began unraveling. One missed meal at a time, the supply chain of the unanimous forces had been utterly destroyed. Though Togon hadn't realized it yet, for now, he assumed the delay was due to logistical setbacks. To sustain his army, he ordered Omar to raid and pillage the occupied territories for provisions. Meanwhile, Togon pressed forward with both land and naval forces advancing toward Thăng Long in a methodical and relentless march. By January 21, 1288, the UN forces launched a coordinated assault on the forward defenses along the Jong River. Diet's great lord Trần Hưng Đạo, ever the master strategist, commanded his troops to engage in a tactical retreat, skirmishing to delay the invaders. While withdrawing on January 27, Tun divided his army into 3 columns, preparing a full-scale assault on Thăng Long. Omar spearheaded the naval forces while Token himself led the infantry reserves. The Yuan's organization was impeccable, their march disciplined and imposing, yet Hưng Đạo had already anticipated this. He ordered ambushes to harass and wear down the unanimous columns while simultaneously evacuating the civilians from Thăng Long. The Tvat forces had already emptied the city of supplies, leaving nothing but a hollow city behind. On January 30, the UN Navy clashed with Tvet forces near Golem, yet, as they moved closer, Diet's warriors sprang from hidden positions in a carefully planned ambush. The fight was swift and intense, but just as quickly as it began, the Diet forces pulled back into the dense terrain. The Yuan soldiers, eager to capitalize on what seemed like a retreat, pursued them, but only for a short distance before hesitating. By now, they should have sensed a pattern. The Tvet weren't retreating out of fear, they were luring them deeper into the trap. By February 2, Toan launched an assault from Jiam, crossing the river to attack Thăng Long. By the time Togon's forces took Thăng Long, it was clear they had won nothing but a hollow prize, the scorched earth. Tactics left the city barren, denying the invaders any chance of resupplying or settling the royal family, and the population had already fled, leaving behind an empty shell of a capital. What little resistance they encountered came from a handful of Tvet soldiers, brave warriors who remained behind as a rear guard, inflicting as much damage as possible for the UN. Meanwhile, another Yen column from Yunnan had been trying to march into Tvet from the north. For days, they were stalled by fierce resistance near Pu Luong, where Tvat forces dug in and held the line. Only after suffering delays and casualties could they push through and join Togon in Thăng Long. As the Yuan consolidated their hold on the capital, their puppet government made a bold move. Escorted by 5,000 UN soldiers, a pro-Mongol regime began marching southward, intent on seizing power. Assuming Tvet resistance was broken, they believed they could stroll into their new domain unchallenged. They couldn't have been more wrong. By late January, a Tvet coalition of royal troops, local militias, and ethnic minority warriors lay in wait at Noi Bang. On February 1, 1288, as the invaders entered the area, the ambush was sprung. The fighting was fierce and decisive. Nearly the entire enemy force was wiped out. Those who survived fled in panic under the cover of night, desperately retreating back toward Un territory. By now the UN army's predicament was undeniable. Sure, they had occupied Thăng Long, but at what cost? They were stranded in a sea of Hostile territory, their vital supply lines completely severed, every move they made was met with resistance, ambushes, hitandron attacks, and relentless harassment. It was as if the land itself conspired against them, sapping their strength and morale with each passing day. And yet this is far from the end of the story. The final chapters of this extraordinary clash are as gripping as they are decisive, so if you've been on the edge of your seat, don't miss what's coming next. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this incredible saga unfolds. It's hard not to stop and think, isn't it? What if history's greatest empires had taken a moment to glance through the pages of Vietnam's enduring story? Maybe, just maybe, the cycles of war and devastation could have been avoided. Vietnam's history has this way of humbling even the mightiest conquerors. Don't believe me? Just ask the Mongols. Let's go back to 1288. By this point, the UN Mongols, yes, the same Mongols, who had swept through much of Asia and Europe like an unstoppable storm, had already tried their luck with Vietnam, or Tvet as it was known then, twice before, and twice they had been thwarted. Yet here they were launching their third invasion. This time they were determined to crush Tvet once and for all. They came prepared. 300,000 massive fleets sailed south, each packed with soldier supplies and weapons. Their strategy was meticulous. After studying the land from their earlier attempts, they chose Vank, a strategically vital location, as their base. Sprawling military camps fortified with tightly packed defenses surrounded by both land and naval forces. The UN Mongols transformed Vank into an impenetrable stronghold, combining the strength of their infantry and their formidable navy. Sure, they'd taken some hits during earlier clashes, but their ranks still boasted overwhelming numbers. Brimming with confidence and armed to the teeth by now, the UN had already seized the capital Thăng Long, modern-day Hanoi, along with the surrounding provinces. Their forces swept through the land trying to hunt down the Tron dynasty court, but Viet wasn't about to make it easy for them. They stayed a step ahead, vanishing like shadows and popping up where least expected. Rumors swirled. Sometimes the king was in Tien Truong, other times in Tanoa. To the Yuan it felt like a frustrating game of cat and mouse for Togon, the Mongol commander. This wasn't just an invasion, it was an obsession. He wanted the Tran king found, and the long saga of Diet's defiance ended. But the longer his troops lingered, the more things started to unravel. It was like déjà vu. The scorching tropical climate drained their energy. Diseases swept through the camps and food supplies thinned out. In the last two campaigns this slow grind had broken their momentum, but this time, learning from past defeats, Toan brought with him an enormous stockpile of supplies, 100 tons of grain, packed onto 600 of the warships. These supply fleets entered Dai late, hoping the delay would slip under the radar of the Tran forces. On February 10, 1288, when Omar was given a daunting task by Togon to lead his naval forces and meet up with a convoy of supply ships. Sounds simple, right? Except that this convoy had been destroyed by the Vet forces nearly a month earlier, and the UN were completely unaware. The supply ships came carrying much-needed provisions, had been ambushed and sunk by the Vet navy right when they entered the waters of Tvet. The Yuan had arrived at Hayong expecting a smooth operation, but instead they ran head first into Diet's forces. There were about 1,000 ships in the Yuan fleet, scattered in multiple smaller groups, making them vulnerable. The Viet navy didn't try to engage them all at once. Instead, they executed a strategy of attrition, striking in waves, attacking ING from multiple directions. The battle raged for hours, with the Viet forces relentlessly harassing the Mongol fleet. Over 300 Mongol ships were lost to the Yet despite the losses, Omar's fleet was still large enough to hold its ground, and he continued to maneuver his forces trying to push back. Omar realized that he was getting nowhere fast. The battle was costly, and the Tvat forces knew when to retreat to avoid unnecessary casualties. As waves of attacks came, the UN pushed on, though not without significant losses. After weeks of trying, Omar finally made it to the K Quang Ninh area, a key point in today's northern Vietnam, where he set up camp and awaited the rest of the supply convoy. This is when the Tvet made a clever move. They secretly released some prisoners, allowing them to escape, and returned to report to Togon about the disaster the Mongol fleet had faced. When Togon received the news, his entire army was shaken. The Mongol forces were now on the defensive, trying to retreat back to Vank, the fortress they had built earlier, but the journey wasn't easy. Along the way, the Ton's force were hammered by independent Tvat forces in over 30 separate engagements. The land from Thong to Von Kip wasn't that far, but the fighting had been so intense that it was clear the UN no longer controlled this territory. The Tvet were pushing them back, reclaiming the land with every passing day. As Omar and his fleet waited for nearly a month in Quang Ninh, hope began to fade. By late March 1288, with no sign of the supply convoy, Omar was desperate. He decided to take his ships through the Bach Dang River and head back to Vank to meet with Togon. With no food on the horizon, Omar and his men began raiding villages along the way, taking whatever they could find. After effort, Omar managed to secure around 40,000 measures of rice, a meager supply to keep his forces from starvation. But even with these setbacks, the Jvat forces knew they couldn't just storm the heavily fortified Mongol positions head-on. It would be a bloodbath. Instead, each night stealthy death squads would slip into Mongol camps, attacking supply depots, burning their resources, and leaving them scrambling in the darkness. There were no reserves left, no backup plan, and the food the Mongols had relied on was gone. Toan was furious. Frustration noted at him as his plans unraveled. He paced, nearly losing his composure in front of his men, who were just as helpless. There was no way to replenish his forces, no way to escape the tightening grip of the Vach. His army was crumbling under the constant pressure. The only choice left for him was to retreat. It was a humiliating decision, but one that saved his life and whatever remained of his army. Great Lord Hunga, however, wasn't about to let the Mongols slip away unscathed. His strategy was clear and deadly: wait until the Mongols were retreating, and then strike. It was a calculated move. When the enemy was retreating, they were ready for it. They were already vulnerable, mentally drained, physically exhausted, and strategically compromised. The Vach would hit them at their most fragile moment on their way out. This would be the final blow. The Jvat were no strangers to naval warfare. With over 1,000 ships at their command, they controlled the waterways, giving them a distinct advantage. The king of the Tran dynasty and the court had joined forces in the north, rallying the troops and boosting the morale of the Jvat forces. The entire war effort had now been fully coordinated, with every soldier from peasants to generals prepared for the final push. Toon's decision to divide his forces seemed like the most sensible option under the circumstances. His infantry would retrace along the familiar path they had taken to invade, while Omar led the naval forces down the Bok Jang River to bolster the fleet's chances. Togon assigned a cavalry contingent to escort them along the riverbanks. On paper, this seemed like a viable plan. In practice, however, it was a logistical nightmare. The cavalry escort struggled to keep pace with the naval fleet, as rugged terrain and destroyed infrastructure made land travel nearly impossible. At Zhang Tri modern Kwangning, the Mongol cavalry encountered a significant obstacle: a destroyed bridge that prevented them from continuing their journey alongside the fleet. Realizing the Jvat likely lay in wait on the other side, the Mongols sought an alternate route. They coerced local elders into guiding them back toward Vank in the hopes of regrouping with Tan's infantry. This decision left Omar's naval forces completely exposed. Without their cavalry escort, the fleet moved at a snail's pace, leaving it vulnerable to the relentless attacks the Jvat were sure to unleash. At this time, Great Lord Hungda is gathering his forces at the mouth of the Bok Jang River, preparing for a showdown with the Mongol fleet. It's a strategic location. The enemy's naval army can't avoid crossing it on their way home from Von Kip Hung Da's plan is bold. His goal is to wipe out the two Mongol forces, both the naval and land troops, leaving no room for them to escape. But here's the challenge: his army doesn't have the manpower to fight these two forces simultaneously. If he focuses on the land forces, the Mongol fleet might slip away, and fighting the land forces, that's where the Mongols are strongest. Their land troops are a massive force, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and touched by the wear and tear of war on Viet soil. So Hung Shao makes a crucial decision. Instead of throwing all his strength into the land forces, he focuses on one thing: the Mongol fleet. For the Viet, warfare on water is second nature. They know every riverbend, every stream, and every island along their coast. They've been at sea on the rivers since birth. Meanwhile, many of the Mongol troops, though fierce on land, are untested in naval combat. Hunga knew that defeating the Mongol navy would not only be a crucial victory on its own, but it would also demoralize the land troops, making them an easier target later. On the Bekong River itself is a natural marvel, a place where 5 streams converge, their waters rushing to the sea through 3 smaller tributaries. It's not a long stretch, barely 5 kilometers, but it's the perfect battleground. Here the river widens and deepens, a trait that changes dramatically with the tides. At high tide the river swells to over 1,200 m across a deceptive expanse that looks like smooth sailing for any fleet. But when the tide the river reveals its true nature, narrowing to expose treacherous depths, some plunging as far as 16 m. This is where Hung Da's genius comes into play. He orders sharp, sturdy stakes crafted from massive limb trees to be driven deep into the riverbed. Each was carefully measured, with diameters ranging from 20 to 30 centimeters and lengths stretching over 2 m, some even approaching 3. Each stake spaced between 90 centimeters and 1.2 m apart, forming an underwater barrier reinforced by Horizontal beams. These aren't just random poles but carefully positioned traps hidden beneath the water. When the tide is high, the stakes stretch across the entrances of the Shan Ken and root tributaries, creating a deadly obstacle course. Their purpose: to stop enemy ships dead in their tracks, force them into tighter channels, and guide them straight into the jaws of Viet's ambush. And what an ambush it is! The stakes serve a dual purpose. They not only block escape routes but also the enemy's ships. When the tide recedes, as the water drains away, these stakes rise like menacing teeth, ready to tear through the hulls of any unsuspecting vessels. The natural topography of the region provided both cover and mobility. Troops and boats could gather in secret, hidden by the towering mountains and thick forests. From these concealed positions, they could launch swift, coordinated strikes. The geography not only concealed the ambush but also allowed Viet's forces to maneuver with ease, striking and retreating as needed. But before you give all the credit to the great Lord Hung's brilliance, let's pause for a moment. His genius wasn't just in strategy, it was in his ability to learn from the past. Over 300 years earlier, on this very stretch of the Bach Dang River, Viet's ancestors had already set a remarkable precedent. In 938, they annihilated the invading southern Han forces using a similar tactic. Here's how it played out during his time. The enemy was on the run, retreating from Vank toward the Bekong River, but this wasn't a hasty escape. Tun's forces were still dangerous, guarded by a powerful cavalry escort. Along the escape route from Vank to Bekong, he positioned a combined force of Viet's army and local militias, each with a crucial mission. First, they were tasked with breaking up the Mongol cavalry, isolating Togon ships from their protection. The idea was simple but effective: deny the enemy their eyes and ears, and they'd be flying blind. By keeping the retreating fleet unaware of the ambush awaiting them along the riverbanks, Hungo ensured his plans remained a well-guarded secret, and so with precision and patience Diet's forces harried the retreating enemy, never fully engaging, only pressuring and steering them toward the trap. The timing of this operation was everything. Hung Die's troops needed to ensure the Mongols reached the ambush site precisely as the tide began to recede. Only then would the stakes hidden beneath the river's surface rise, turning the calm waters into a graveyard for enemy ships. It was the 9th of April, 1288, and the mighty Yuan Mongol fleet, fresh from their relentless campaign, was making its way down the Bekong River. The tide was high, and the sea was calm, which was exactly what great Lord Hungda had been waiting for. The Dvet fleet went out in full force, rowing toward the Yuan. Eager and confident, the Yuan took the bait. Thinking the Dvet forces were retreating, they pushed their entire fleet into the river, chasing down what they thought was an easy target. But as they moved deeper into the river, the tide was already starting to shift, as if on cue. Just as great Lord Hunga had predicted, the water began to recede, pulling the UN ships into a deadly trap. They hadn't realized it yet, but they were already entering the heart of the ambush. The Diet fleet, still pretending to retreat, then suddenly turned on a dime. From the flanks, ships surged forward, surrounding the Omar forces on all sides. Then, as if from nowhere, the Yuan found themselves entangled in a field of sharp wooden stakes hidden just beneath the surface. They were now helpless as their ships smashed into the spikes, breaking apart and sinking one by one. The river, which had been so peaceful just moments ago, erupted in chaos. The Viet forces launched their counterattack. Some ships charged head-on into the Yuan lines, while others flanked and attacked from the sides. And if that wasn't enough, at just the right moment, boats loaded with fire-starting materials were launched into the water, sending waves of flames into the heart of the UN fleet. An entire stretch of the Bakong River lit up in a blaze of fire as the invader ships were consumed by flames, their wooden hulls crackling and snapping in the heat. But even then, the UN Mongols weren't done yet. They tried to regroup and pushed their forces up to the Trainen Mountains, hoping the higher ground would give them an advantage. But just as they thought they had found some safety, another hidden force from Dvet, waiting in the mountains, was ready. As the UN troops made their stand, the Diet ambush struck hard, pushing them down into the river. Nestled within the river is rocky coast, a natural barrier made up of 5 jagged stone outcrops. These stones block nearly 3/4 of the river's width, turning the flow into a series of narrow, treacherous channels. This natural defense became a silent ally, stopping the ships in their tracks. The river's winding path, combined with the rocks jutting from the water, forced the UN into narrow passages where they couldn't maneuver, making them vulnerable. As the UN ships struggled to find a way through the river's winding paths, Viet's forces closed in the escape route to Nam Trio. The only hope of retreat was blocked. The UN had no choice but to face the relentless force of Viet's null might or perish. In the jaws of the Bakong River, one by one their ships were pierced, sinking like dominoes, falling one after the other. The battle reached its peak with the air thick with Smoke in the water stained with blood. Great Lord Hung Da along with King Trần Tong and former King Trần Tong led the final charge. Their fleet, the mightiest of the Dvet, was ready to strike. The king's presence leading the charge was like a spark that set the entire army ablaze with energy. Every sword strike, every arrow shot was a nail in the coffin for the invaders. The elite guards, those who usually protected the royal family, now had the chance to fight freely, and they poured their fury onto the invaders. Every oar stroke, every sail, every weapon was a part of this overwhelming tide. Meanwhile, the UN Mongol forces were crumbling. The very sight of the royal fleet charging in sent waves of panic through their ranks. It was as if the ground was falling away beneath them. They tried to fight back, but the tide had already turned the D. It closed in like a wave crashing over rocks. Relentless and unstoppable, the battle surged forward with the roar of battle cries, the clash of steel, and the shrieks of the dying. Blood soaked to the river, staining at a deep crimson, as the Yuan found themselves surrounded on all sides. By the end of the battle, it was clear the Yen Mongol army had been completely, utterly defeated. Their once proud fleet, about 600 strong, was either destroyed or captured. Nearly 400 ships were taken by the Viet, and the remaining 200 were sunk beneath the waves, their wreckage sinking into the depths of the river. The Yuan Mongol soldiers, around 60,000 strong, were either dead or captured. Not a single one escaped on land. A blend of royal roll soldiers and local militias pursued the Togon team relentlessly. Thousands of them cut across the land and set up ambushes, blocking every escape route. The Yen forces were forced into battle after battle just to break free, but for every inch they gained they lost more soldiers. Togon had no choice but to send a small force of 3,000 elite troops to cover the retreat of the rest of his army. But just as it seemed like the Yuan Mongols were on the brink of being completely wiped out, a change in command came from the highest authority. The King Trần Tong issued an order: cease the pursuit, stop the chase, let Ton's forces retreat. It was a surprising move, but one that carried immense strategic weight. Great Lord Hung Da and the king understood the bigger picture. They wanted to inflict enough damage to show the Un dynasty the strength of Viet, but they also knew that continuing the chase could lead to endless conflict. The unanimous dynasty was vast and powerful, and another drawn-out war could devastate the people of Dvet. Trần Tong, ever the visionary, believed in peace, not just victory. But the decision wasn't easy for everyone. The Viet soldiers, burning with the rage of past invasions, wanted to see their enemy crushed entirely. They couldn't stomach the idea of sparing Togon after everything they had suffered. Driven by anger and a thirst for vengeance, the commanders ignored the king's order and continued to press the retreating on. They used the terrain to their advantage: high mountains and thick forests, setting traps, raining poisoned arrows, and ambushing the UN. At every turn the UN soldiers, already beaten down, fell in droves, their bodies piling up along the roads. It was a brutal sight. And then, after what must have felt like an eternity, Tone and what remained of his army stumbled back to their homeland, broken and blooded. It was February 19, 1288. The invasion that had started with thousands of fierce soldiers now ended with a mere handful limping home. Their morale shattered, their spirit crushed. The third Mongol invasion of Dvet, a campaign that had seemed unstoppable at the start, had come to a brutal and humiliating end.